Good morning. So just want to begin by acknowledging that I'm delivering this plenary talk on Wurundjeri land, and I'd like to pay my respects to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations and their elders past, present and emerging. Sovereignty was never ceded, which means that I live and work on stolen land. And as we speak about relational approaches to studying drone violence, I invite you to reflect upon the historic and continued colonial violence against Indigenous peoples in your own countries of residence. I live in a settler colonial country that continues to abuse and mistreat Aboriginal people, and that is also actively involved in overseas wars, including through drone operations. Indeed, Australia is currently embroiled in an inquiry about war crimes that Australian Special Forces soldiers committed in Afghanistan. I do not think that our race relations at home and those overseas are coincidental. Indeed, these are the circulations of colonial violence, and I encourage you to reflect on these circulations as I give my presentation. Thank you so much to Dr. Michael Richardson and to Madeline Weber for organising this extraordinary symposium. And for inviting me to give the plenary talk. I've really enjoyed the symposium and have tried to integrate a few of our discussions into this talk. Okay, so in September last year, at least 30 pine nut workers were killed in a US drone attack in eastern Nangarhar province, and a further 40 people were injured. They had just finished a day's work harvesting pine nuts. They'd pitched their tents and were sitting by their bonfire when US drone missiles struck them. The drone attack had intended to hit an Islamic State hideout, but killed these civilian workers instead. Haider Khan, the owner of the pine nut field, said that many of the 150 workers there that night had gone missing. Their bodies could not be found or identified amongst the dead. They had seemingly vanished. This attack was just one of a record number of attacks last year. The US dropped over 7,400 bombs and other munitions in Afghanistan in 2019. The most since the Pentagon began keeping track in 2006, and an 8-fold increase from 2015. The United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan reported that more civilians were killed by the US and pro-Afghan government forces last year than were killed by the Taliban and Islamic State. Military drones have been deployed by the United States in Afghanistan since 2001, with the support of allies such as the UK and Australia. However, in these nations that use or actively contribute to military drone violence, we hear little about how that violence affects the lives and well-being of Afghan people who live under drones. We don't know what happens to the friends, families, and communities of the injured, the dead, and the vanished. My PhD research was guided by the research question, how should we understand the relationship between US Air Force drone personnel and people living under drones in targeted areas of Afghanistan? This question emerged mostly out of my frustration at how drone violence is discussed and conceptualized both in the public sphere and in my academic discipline of international relations. So firstly, there is the, of course, dangerous endorsement of drone strikes by government and military spokespeople who claim that drones are a precise way of waging war. This official narrative remains pervasive, and it's strikingly obvious to see how the language used by US officials many years ago has been picked up and mimicked over the years by the United States allies. So you can see here the kind of words that CIA Director John Brennan was using back in 2012 have been picked up by the UK government, the Australian government and Air Force as they try to justify their own drone programs. So I'm not going to spend too long debunking these official claims here, as I don't have the time in this presentation, and you can read some angry opinion editorials that I've written about this elsewhere. However, suffice it to say, these claims of precise and humanitarian war, when waged by the technologically advanced global north, have repeatedly proven to be myth. Even the 2003 shock and awe bombing of Iraq was claimed to be surgical and precise, despite it being a period of sustained bombing with 2,000-pound munitions for many weeks. I'm just going to give you a moment now to read those comments by then US Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld in the Pentagon briefing. So he described it as targeted an air campaign as has ever existed. This initial 3 weeks of bombing Baghdad and other major Iraqi cities is now known to have killed an average of 317 civilians each day and destroyed civilian infrastructure, inflicting far-reaching harms. A hospital, a university, electricity supplies, water supplies, sewage facilities, and shopping markets were all bombed. So I find these official narratives to be very frustrating. But then there is a more complex frustration that I have with existing work on drone violence. And this actually pertains to drone violence criticism. This is somewhat harder and more time consuming to explain. As someone who is vocal in their criticism of military drones, shouldn't I be on the same side as other critics? However, intentionally or not, critiques of drone violence often employ language, conceptual frameworks, or types of evidence that dehumanize and disembody the people who are most affected by drone violence. In other words, people who are maimed, killed, and psychologically affected in targeted areas remain invisible and voiceless, even in drone violence criticism. There are 4 main types of drone violence criticism that I think dehumanize or erase those upon whom drone violence is inflicted. And I'm sure you'll recognize some or all of these. So the first being an argument around nation-state sovereignty. So this is the idea that drone attacks undermine and threaten nation-state sovereignty. My issue with sovereignty-based critiques is that they are inattentive to numerous instances where national governments have explicitly or tacitly supported or failed to condemn US drone attacks in their territory. While sovereignty-based criticisms have some merit, I argue that they give inadequate consideration to the imperial nature of the relationship between the United States and countries such as Afghanistan and Pakistan, and the state violences that Afghanistan and Pakistani governments commit against their own citizens. So in Afghanistan, the US-backed Afghan government has seldom condemned US drone attacks, at least publicly, even ignoring several drone attacks that have killed Afghan police and Afghan National Army soldiers. This is unsurprising given Afghanistan is a weak state and compliant with US foreign policy in exchange for national security and international legitimacy. Indeed, the United States funds and trains the newly established Afghan Air Force, who are also carrying out airstrikes in Afghanistan that have killed and otherwise harmed civilians. Drone criticism that's voiced from the perspective of sovereignty gives a free pass to drone attacks that happen with the state's consent or with the state's silence. So a second common argument against drones is around international law and the just war tradition. And this is the argument that drone attacks violate international law and principles of just war, particularly last resort and proportionality. International humanitarian law prohibits military attacks that may be expected to cause loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, damage to civilian objects, or a combination thereof, if and only if that loss, injury, or damage is excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated. So this is known as the principle of proportionality, and it's codified in Additional Protocol 1 of the Geneva Conventions. And this legally allows lethal and injurious attacks on civilians if the anticipated military advantage is considered to outweigh that civilian harm. Many critiques of drone violence are voiced within frameworks of international law, thereby using the principle of proportionality to make their assessments as to whether drone violence is ethical or unethical. But operating within this framework of international law and applying this proportionality principle normalizes what A.L. Wiseman calls a cold calculus, whereby the lives of war-affected people are reduced to numerical figures to be weighed against potential military advantage. Wiseman refers to these calculations required of the proportionality principle as gruesome. People are depicted not as full agents with rich and complex lives, but as collateral. Their deaths are reduced to negative externalities of interactions between other more important and more powerful entities, namely states and international institutions. I also think that critiques from the perspective of international law are politically too moderate. The argument that emerges from using international law conserves the status quo of international relations and goes that if the United States killed fewer civilians, a more proportionate number, then their acts would be ethical and legal. Relatedly, and this is an extension of the international law argument, there is an issue of civilian casualty data being used as the primary or only form of evidence for harm inflicted in drone violence. The myriad other ways in which civilian lives are made and unmade by drone violence is not considered. Thomas Gregory argues that civilian casualty recording, quote, ends up producing a strangely disembodied account of war. Bodies are counted, he continues, yet we rarely hear what actually happens to the body in war. Many scholars from Elaine Scary to Susan Sontag have written convincingly on the limitations of language and images to adequately communicate the horror of war. However, these modes can convey much more about the ongoing harms inflicted in war than civilian casualty figures can. That's not to say that civilian casualty recording should cease, only to point out that our effective response to these deaths are limited by their representation as quantitative data, and that harms such as injuries and living with disability, psychological distress, grief, and loss of land and property cannot be recognized or measured in these metrics. As post-colonial scholar Hamadeep Mukherjee asks, quote, is there a way to improve the quality of our thinking about destruction, some more meaningful, qualitatively more humane way, perhaps? And lastly, another common critique of drone violence is voiced through concern at increasing autonomy of military technology. And that's the idea that drones signal a troubling shift away from humans and human agency in war to autonomous warfighting. So this is an issue that my issue with this kind of argument is one that I tried to articulate earlier in the week during the drone militarisms panel. I think it's important that we research and write about technological agency, the autonomous functions of drones, and the ways that drones operate within a broader apparatus, which is also largely technological. However, I think that there is a delicate balance involved when writing about the agency of technologies and humans, one which scholars in my discipline have rarely pulled off without depicting drones as an all-powerful technology. I think such depictions can be analytically and politically problematic. Analytically, questions of human agency are missed when we focus too intently on the agential capacities of drone technology. With a technocentric approach, it makes no difference whether a drone operator is Islamophobic or a Muslim, has violent intent or is scared of launching missiles, wants a lifelong career in the Air Force, or desperately wants to quit their job. The institutional cultures within different drone units and air forces seem not to matter either. I would argue that those things do matter and that they do change the violence and its effects. These technocentric approaches are also politically problematic in that they close down future avenues for political resistance. Hart and Negri write that, quote, apocalyptic visions of power close down political engagement with power, such as that we're left with no hope of transforming such power along a democratic course. While it may not be the intention of the authors, many authors who focus their research on the agential capacities of drone technology present the drone apparatus as so overwhelmingly powerful, it is near impossible to imagine ways of effectively protesting, disrupting, and preventing drone violence. So I refer to these 4 common forms of drone violence criticism as non-relational or minimally relational. By non-relational, I mean that they do not see drone personnel and people living under drones as internally related, with the capacity to affect and be affected by each other. And they therefore locate the violence outside of these social relations between humans. These non-relational analyses of drone violence paint actors such as the state, international institutions, and semi-autonomous technologies as the most important or central actors in drone violence. They erase humans and human agency, including people whose voices are already excluded and pushed to the margins in global political dialogue. And I'm especially referring here to people who live in drone-targeted areas. They neglect consideration of the interpersonal dimensions of drone violence, that drone violence has human victims and human perpetrators whose lives are altered, changed, and even destroyed by the other. And they reduce the temporality of drone violence to the moment a drone strike kills a person, thereby missing harmful effects of the violence that occurs before and can continue long after the moment of a lethal strike. So non-relational approaches treat war as made up of discrete events of state sovereignty and international law violations, or lethal strikes that cause another tally on the civilian casualty count, but seemingly no other form of harm. Politically, non-relational drone violence criticism tends to make very restricted normative arguments about what needs to change in the governance of drones. So as an example here on the slide, you can see that Amnesty International has made a very centrist statement here that it doesn't condemn the US's use of armed drones, just wants to ensure that the US abides by international law. So this very moderate statement is unsurprising given that Amnesty International is a non-government organization who operates within the confines of international law, including the principle of proportionality that I explained just before. So my research question emerged out of my frustrations at these common approaches to researching and talking about drone violence. I wanted to foreground lived experiences in the study of drone violence, experiences which are sensory and embodied. I also wanted to properly recognize and consider the implications and the effects of the relationship between American drone personnel and Afghan people subjected to drone violence. So in seeking to answer the research question, how should we understand the relationship between US Air Force drone personnel and Afghan people living under drones, I spent 6 months conducting multi-sided fieldwork in Afghanistan, Greece, and the United States from February to July 2017. This fieldwork involved open-ended, semi-structured, and unstructured interviews with people who were living in or had previously lived in areas subjected to military drone surveillance and bombing. I also interviewed people who had previously worked for the US Air Force's drone program. All Afghan interviewees had lived in provinces currently or previously subjected to US drone surveillance and bombardment, including Kabul province, Wardak, Host, Nangarhar, Paktia, Kandahar, Logar, and Daikundi, which for those who are unfamiliar with the geography of Afghanistan actually includes provinces in like the north, southeast, west, and central Afghanistan, so all around the country. In the United States, interviewees comprise not only of drone pilots and sensor operators, but also intelligence analysts and communications technicians. So I'm now going to talk about some of the harms that can be uncovered when you foreground lived experiences and apply a relational analysis to the study of drone violence. In my PhD, I explain many more of these harms, but in this talk, I have time to only go through 2. So the first is a psychosocial harm inflicted in the surveillance relationship between drone personnel and Afghan people that I refer to as objectification and self-objectification. Drones can stay airborne for up to 20 hours, and the drone's visual conduits can collect and transmit aerial surveillance footage for far longer than piloted aircraft because human pilots become fatigued. This increase in surveillance capacity opens up Afghan people to having weeks and months of their lives tracked and analyzed by American drone personnel. Moreover, the fetishization of the drone in the United States means that drone surveillance is experienced as even more invasive. Whether this invasive is real or imagined does not matter. According to interviewees in Afghanistan, on-the-ground US military personnel have given exaggerated accounts of how clearly and extensively drone cameras can see, providing the Afghan National Army and Afghan police with misinformation about the drone's technical capacities that has then been spread amongst some Afghan people. This real and imagined surveillance limits Afghans' control over their behaviors and their movements. Therefore, I argue psychosocially harming them. As Wahab, a 21-year-old from Nangarhar province puts it, we were ashamed that those airplanes could come and record our private moments, but we can't do anything about it. We'd have the curtains and the doors of our house closed to try to prevent their recording, but we didn't want the military to see our wives, our sisters, and our mothers. But this is useless because we still had to walk outside our houses, and when we did, we didn't feel relaxed. Every individual action of ours, they were recording. So this is interesting in many ways, but one of the ways it's interesting is that US military drones don't actually have the capacity to see into the windows and the doors of people's private residences. They can only hover above them, and yet this kind of misinformation has spread about the surveillance capacities of the drone. Saifullah, a 39-year-old pharmacy assistant from Daikundi province, heard a US military spokesperson in the media say that drones can see down to 1 inch. Muhammad, a 40-year-old farmer from Wardak province, similarly stated that, I heard, but I don't know exactly that it can see down and spot very small things. It can see a talib or a gun or a civilian and know what they're doing. But we don't know how much they can see, and our request is don't watch civilian families. From the perspective of US Air Force drone personnel, this invasion of privacy might seem unremarkable. Former Air Force sensor operator John said that there were times when we'd watch people go out in the middle of a field in the middle of nighttime and they'd take a shit and you could see the hot spot that they left. These things stopped being awkward and they became kind of normal. Like someone is taking a shit, someone is pissing, someone is fucking, someone is drinking, or like watching people mourn at funerals or people celebrating weddings or birthdays or sitting at a cafe with friends. A former sensor operator for the US Air Force, Richard, said that it's just like sitting in a mall watching people walk by. Same concept, different platform, different medium, that's it. You can get a little bit more personal with a predator than you do sitting on a park bench, but you know, in the end, it's still the same thing. You're observing the qualities of that person. You're observing the behaviors of that person. When you equate it to that, you can justify in your mind that it's nothing different. That's how I justified it. The visual conduits of the drone enact a stark visibility-invisibility divide, reproducing the view that Afghan people are not considered worthy of privacy and dignity. As such, they can be uncontroversially subjected to the gaze of US Air Force drone personnel. For some Afghans, awareness of how they are viewed as suspicious, devious, or criminal can cause self-policing of their behaviors and social activities in an attempt to not be perceived in this way by American drone personnel and targeted in a drone strike. This affects one's freedom of movement and leads to the denigration of personal and cultural traits previously valued in the community, causing psychosocial harm that needs to be more widely recognized in drone violence criticism. As Abdul Qudus, a 45-year-old farmer from Wardak province who lost his brother in a drone attack in 2015, puts it, with the drone coming, we visit each other less, and in the night, if something happens to a family, we cannot go to visit them. It's taken away our comfort from us. If we go to visit a friend, we cannot stay to spend the night. We cannot do proper empathy, sharing our sadness, because we cannot stay. From the point of view of our culture, staying the night is very good as it gives comfort to the family, especially if something sad has happened. But we cannot stay anymore because we feel uncomfortable. We are afraid of this bungana. Ahmad, a 21-year-old volunteer primary school teacher, also from Wadak province, but a different village, explains that young men his age used to hang out in the evenings, especially in the summer, to, quote, discuss, make fun, and tell jokes till very late at night. But they can't do this anymore because of fear and worry. He describes his life as like living in a prison. Despite ostensibly having freedom of movement, he feels that he's imprisoned. He is seen as a criminal and unable to move freely because he is always already guilty. Life is like being in a prison, he said, but the prison is big. You cannot meet at night, go for dinners. You cannot move easily and without fear. You cannot continue to perform your culture and your celebrations. What kind of a life is this? Marginalized and oppressed groups, including colonized peoples who have been subject to the scrutiny and objectifying surveillance gaze of dominant oppressive groups, are at much higher risk of internalizing this gaze. This is because seeing as the dominant group can help keep them safe from the dominant group's violence. Self-objectification, feminist psychologist Elaine Zerbruggen argues, involves a person internalizing the perspective of the other, of an external observer, to the point that his or her own perspective and even reality is lost. Psychologists most often apply this concept of self-objectification in regard to women internalizing sexist and racist evaluations of their body and physical appearance, and then judging themselves on those internalized standards. However, this concept has also been explored by post-colonial scholars to make sense of how people of color have their self-understanding affected by white people's objectifying and stereotyping gazes. So, for example, the decolonial and anti-colonial psychiatrist Frantz Fanon spoke similarly of this phenomena, giving a personal anecdote about sitting on a train in colonial Algeria, surrounded by white people looking at him and refusing to sit next to him. He said, instead of one seat, they left me 2 or 3. He wrote that his relationship with his body was made pathological because of these encounters with the white gaze. That underneath a normal body schema, wherein one has good bodily awareness and control, is, quote, a historical racial schema in which the other, the white man, had woven him out of 1,000 details, anecdotes, and stories. In other words, Fanon's body was not his to know or to be in control of. He was made to rethink what he knows about his body each time he was subjected to the white gaze. As he explained, the body schema attacked in several places collapsed, giving way to an epidermal racial schema. He wrote of his experience on the train that, quote, I transported myself on that particular day, very far away from myself, and gave myself up as an object. It's this giving oneself up as an object that self-objectification describes. Afghan people living under drones are frequently made to think about how they are perceived by US Air Force drone personnel and internalize this objectification in order to survive. The US Air Force objectifies Afghan people by seeing them primarily as potential threats, poised on the verge of becoming dangerous. Objectified as potential threats, Afghan people living under drone surveillance are denied the full and complex range of their humanity, their personality, intellect, sense of humor, creativity, generosity, hopes, and dreams. So an Afghan villager leaving his home at nighttime to comfort a grieving neighbor, as Abdul previously did, or to converse and joke with a group of friends like Ahmad, is not caring or compassionate or affable or funny. They are assumed to be suspicious. Albert Memmi refers to this as the mark of the plural, arguing that, quote, the colonized is never characterized in an individual manner. He is entitled only to drown in an anonymous collectivity. So the second form of harm that I want to talk about is estrangement from the land and the environment, and the related economic harms of this estrangement. I'll just take a little bit of a drink. So estrangement from the environment is another ongoing harm inflicted on Afghan people through US drone violence, continuing a history of North-South relations whereby people in the global South have their natural environments destroyed and their self-sufficiency undermined. Abdul Qudus lives in a mountain village community in Wardak, where he says the community's lives are connected to the mountain. They take their animals to the mountain to graze. They collect bushes for firewood, for warmth and for cooking. They collect mushrooms and leeks to eat, and water irrigation pipes run from a spring on the mountain down onto their farms. Abdul's brother was killed by a US drone attack on that same mountain in 2015. The drone attack that killed his brother left the bombarded site of the mountainside blackened by fire and also killed 3 of their family's goats. In the previous year, 4 other civilians had been killed. In previous years, 4 other civilians had been killed by US drones on the mountain. Abdul said, "I don't remember the year, but it was before my brother's death. They were also civilians. They had also gone to the mountain to bring bushes on their shoulders, collecting firewood for cooking and heating. Some of them had gone up there with their animals to the mountain. The whole village life is with the mountain. It is a mountain village location." Since US drone attacks have killed villagers on this mountain, the community's relationship to the mountain has changed significantly. Abdul said, "Now we go to the mountain less. When we go to connect the pipes and organize the irrigation of our farms, we do it in a hurry, not like normal. We go with fear. We cannot care as well for our farms as before because our access to the mountain is limited." Abdul was not the only interviewee who expressed a close connection with and dependency on nearby mountains. Ahmadullah, who lives in a different village, also explained that his community relies upon neighboring mountains. He said, "We go to the mountains to collect bushes for fuel as firewood. And when we go to collect those bushes, we go with fear and we're very afraid because if the aircraft comes or the drone, they think that in the mountains, everybody is Taliban. But that is our culture. We go to collect firewood from the mountain because we need it for our tandoor, which are bread ovens." 2 other men, Muhammad and Ahmadullah, live in a village where the economy is primarily based on agriculture, and most of the family own farms, and they all share 1 water irrigation pipe. The family takes turns throughout the day and the night to ensure that everyone's farms are irrigated and that the water is not wasted. And this is organized through a randomized ballot system. Since the United States began flying drones over their village, Muhammad and Ahmadullah feel frustrated and afraid when they draw a night shift from the ballot. Muhammad said that if he hears a drone while irrigating his land at night, he will switch off the flashlight and leave the irrigation to go home. He described the toll that this takes on his family's income. He said, "If I miss the water on my turn to leave and go home, then my wheat dries out because I have to wait till my next turn. The water comes out without control because I'm not there to control it, and I lose that water. It is wasted." Ahmadullah similarly stated that if he irrigates his farm at night, he is afraid he'll be attacked. He said, "The military think that flashlights are only used by the opposition, but they should understand that normal people use them also for their irrigation or if they are going somewhere." So given that 50% of Afghan households rely on agricultural work as a source of income and 30% as their main source of income, US drone violence that prevents people from farming and irrigating can undermine many Afghans' capacity to be self-sufficient. Further, the ability to irrigate land is much more valuable than simple ownership of land in Afghanistan, a country where only 12% of the soil is arable, and where farming families survive on their own wheat and other crops. Political economists Haider and Kumar likewise find that there is not much difference in land ownership between poor and non-poor families in Afghanistan, They write that what really matters is its irrigation status, whether some source of irrigation is available to the farmers. That the United States Air Force continues to fly drones over civilians' farms in Muhammad and Ahmadullah's village, preventing irrigation, comes at a significant economic and psychological cost to these farmers and their families who have lost entire crop harvests because their irrigation has been disrupted. In addition to the economic effects of this and resultant psychological distress, there is also the psychological harm of this altered relationship with the land, from a relation of close connection to one of estrangement. This is similar to what Brent J. Steele refers to as architectural scarring that entails the literal destruction of the built environment, as well as the metaphorical scarring of people's affective and emotional connections to that environment. While Steele is referring to feelings of loss, grief, and fear towards damaged or destroyed built environments, these feelings can also be evoked by the damage and destruction of natural environments. So the estrangement of Afghan people from the land is yet another ongoing harm inflicted in US drone violence that is not captured by the non-relational frameworks that I discussed at the beginning of this talk. Domestic counterterrorism discourse in Western countries has, and particularly since 9/11, taken what's called critical infrastructure protection seriously. And they talk about critical infrastructure protection increasingly so in evaluations of how cyber attacks may affect national security in the future by bringing down electricity grids or communication networks. To a limited extent, this emphasis on critical infrastructure protection at home is reflected in the laws of armed conflict, in that there is a protection of hospitals and ambulances not to be targeted in military attack, even if quote unquote enemy combatants are present. However, in both critical infrastructure protection discourse and the laws of armed conflict, only human-built infrastructure is deemed critical to support human life. Trees and plants, non-human animals, natural sources of water, among the wide range of other biotic and abiotic components of ecosystems, are not considered critical infrastructure. So this is kind of like what I hope is the original contribution of my thesis, is this concept that I've developed called the drone interface. I've developed this concept in order to draw attention to the conduits of social relations between drone personnel and people living under drones. Many, but not all of these conduits are technological. This is drawing on the work of Kyle Grayson, who approaches the drone as an interface and conduit that produces, quote, the subjects of drone operators and those upon whom drone strikes are initiated. The drone, he argues, is, quote, a key nodal point for producing affective, emotional, and subjective dynamics that are felt. So I want to build on these insights by Kyle Grayson, but I expand the concept of the interface to not only describe the drone's visual senses. Instead, I use the interface as a catch-all term to refer to the visual, auditory, emotive, imaginative, discursive, ideological, among other conduits of social relations in drone violence. So in conclusion, identifying that drone violence criticism is limited by not accounting for the people in drone violence and their social relations, I undertook a project that sought to answer how should we understand the relationship between US Air Force drone operators and people living under drones in Afghanistan. I came up with this concept of the drone interface, which applies a relational approach to the study of drone violence. I argue that only a relational approach to drone violence can document and recognize the wide range of emotional, psychological, social, and economic harms inflicted in drone violence. And I thought I'd end by bringing together some threads of discussion over the last 3 days. These are some questions that remain unanswered for me and that I'll continue to ponder in the coming days. So how do we research technological agency without playing into technological fetishism and erasing the humans most affected? What does resistance to drone violence, network violence, and weapons development entail, and who is involved in this resistance? If it's something like the use of camouflage to subvert surveillance, as Olga discussed in her talk on Tuesday, how would surveilled communities get access to this, particularly in areas like of rural Afghanistan? How do we research and talk about drone violence without making it out as exceptional, something that I often feel guilty of myself? And do things like noise, disruption, and crashes have any resistant potential in undermining state violence, or are they a planned and accounted for part of the broader structure? So thank you all for listening, and I look forward to hearing your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex. This presentation was just phenomenal. I think there's so much there for us to flesh out, and especially those final questions. What a succinct way to kind of wrap up everything all the issues that have really been raised over the past 3 days. So that was great. We might head into discussion rooms to think about the questions that we might like to ask Alex for the Q&A. So Michael, would you mind?
Yep, sure. I'm going to launch those right now. So you should have your little invitation to join at the bottom. If you'd like to join and have a quick short discussion before we come back as a group, that would be wonderful. That was great, Alex.
Thank you. I haven't talked for that long in such a long time that my throat was getting very itchy.
It's actually like, it's hard to sort of sustain for that length of time. Particularly, I've given a couple of longish talks over Zoom, and it's like, it's hard as well because you're not getting the like audience feedback as well. So I find it like, I gave a talk, like a half-hour, 40-minute, same kind of thing talk in Dresden the other night, and which is a weird thing to say, but and there was like 80 people in attendance or something, but like it's also like speaking to no one.
Yeah.
Because like I couldn't see anyone, and the way I had my screen set up and stuff, I actually just couldn't even see the few people who still had their video on, and so you're kind of like talking. It's like talking into the abyss, and I don't know if you do this, but like I make, well, I mean, you don't actually, because you didn't in this talk, but like, I often make like kind of dry, like black humor remarks at times. Like, I don't know. I mean, like before I was researching drones, I was researching torture. And so I've been like, engaged with all this stuff for like 10 years now. And I know that I'm not alone in like having to have that kind of like capacity to disassociate enough to intellectually engage without giving up one's political urgency and without giving up the passion and like drive, right? But yeah, when you're making like kind of bad black humor jokes to like an abyss as well, I was like, oh my God, stop it. Don't make any more. Yeah. Like, but yeah, I mean, it's really your work's so interesting. And I mean, I think so important. I'm like, I really buy your critique of those first three categories. But I'm like less convinced on the fourth one, sorry, around the like autonomous technology folks, and I don't know whether that is because I feel guilty by association or because I know so many of those people and know their work and have a lot of time for it. And I wonder whether, and maybe you would agree with this actually, that like I wonder whether their project pulls in a different direction. And but I agree with you that there is that risk of like the over fetishization. Like, I really like, I'm a big admirer of Antoine's work, and I like him a lot personally as well. But, you know, there are those bits in like Eye of War, right, where it is very like, you know, we have entered into this like maximalist phase where like anyone could die at any point around the world. And it's this very kind of, which like I don't think is true. And it's because certainly not anyone can die. It's actually like those specific people who are dying, or who are living with the ever presence of that threat. But I don't know, I guess like, yeah.
I think in my thesis and in my writing, I'm like a lot more generous to those that I'm critiquing, but in the structure of a talk where you're like, like simplify your positionality a bit.
Yeah.
It comes off that I'm like neck and neck with these folks. I mean, I also have a lot of time for Antoine Bisquet and like Alka Schwartz as well. Like, you know, I actually do really like their work. I just occasionally find it quite totalizing, and you can also like read pages of their work without them mentioning like who the like victims of this violence are. So that worries me as well.
I agree. I'm really, it would be so great to like have that conversation actually with like, say, with Elka and Antoine. Like that'd be a really great kind of like discussion, because I don't think they would disagree with you actually about, like, I think they would consider your work to be incredibly valuable and wouldn't disagree with you politically at all. And that's my guess anyway. But it's interesting because I think, you know, like I work with similar kinds of theory and stuff that some of those folks do. And that theory has its own imperative sometimes as well, which like becomes hard to resist, because like certain types of theory that might privilege the agency of media or of technological structures, it's very easy to slip into that kind of totalizing language. Because that's sort of what the theory seems to want sometimes, and you have to kind of actively push back. Like
actor network theory, or
well, like I'm thinking particularly of like, so like, you know, say like Antoine's book is like quite influenced by Paul Virilio and his approach, and then like also the kind of STS approach to technology, which sees so not necessarily like actor network theory, I think is problematic because of its kind of flatness, but like the kind of or like, you know, I guess through Virilio and other places, but like Kittler is really influential on and in those sorts of theories, like the media, you know, Kittler's like famous line about the media determines our situation can become kind of overwhelming, I think, and it does risk exactly what you're talking about. Yeah, it's a tricky thing to negotiate, I think.
I think, I mean, the other difficult thing, and we talked about this a bit yesterday, is like differentiating between talking about drone futures and talking about the drone present as well, because like, you know, autonomous and network technologies are currently with us, but to a much more limited capacity, and like pointing out those limitations right now is so crucial. But when people give presentations that seem to be about drone futures or technological futures, they don't necessarily like give the caveat that like, actually this is just stuff that DARPA is currently experimenting with, not like for now.
Yeah, there's a lot of presentations about, say, like the Argus IS, or a lot of writing about the Argus IS system, for example, that kind of glosses over the fact that like it doesn't work, and like was never actually made operational, and that like a lot of the military stuff that bubbles out is fantasy, but which is like actually super interesting and really important, but I think you have to deal with that element of the imaginary in talking about that technology, and not like become seduced by it. And as I say this, like I'm kind of you know, I'm also talking about like, you know, the things I have to keep telling myself in writing about this stuff.
Yeah, I tried to say in my talk that these kind of imaginaries that we have in the West, like, don't stay contained within the West.
Mm-hmm.
Like, people in Afghanistan have, you know, heard of these embellishments about the technology, and that's now affecting their behavior. So it's like,
yeah,
I need to be careful thinking that it's just kind of like an intellectual activity. You know, there is like a real world effect of thinking and presenting the technology in this way. Yeah.
I'm writing this book at the moment on non-human witnessing, and you know, a big thread in the book is drone war and increasingly autonomous war in general. And you know, your work's been really helpful in trying to build out that constellation that and try to articulate a picture and develop from that a kind of critique that can work with the agential qualities of certain forms of technology and the imaginaries that come out of like the military apparatus and the technology companies alongside it, but also to kind of bring with it the you know, the story of the people on the ground and the way they're actually articulating that damage. Because I think it's like, it's how we like, yeah, how we have to work differently in terms of critical intervention, and perhaps, you know, in terms of anti-war protest and anti-war activism and so on. It can't be like I think anyway, it can't be in the form that worked successfully in the Vietnam War. Like it has to respond analytically to start with to a much more complex field of technopolitics and of social relations, like, you know, and that the way you kind of pull together the experience of the pilots as into relation with those on the ground. And then the third thing is really valuable, and the third thing for me then is like the agencies of the technologies and infrastructures and environments and so on.
My dog has just come back from a walk and is currently doing a Zoomies, so hopefully that doesn't disrupt that audio too much.
No worries.
Hey everyone. So I guess most of us are back. Yeah, so I know that I was actually in a group and we had a couple of questions, so I'm wondering if I just begin. Cool. So Alex, on behalf of my group, we were just kind of wondering, in terms of the logistics of how you went about actually doing the fieldwork in the first place, and, you know, both the kind of pragmatics of it. So did you have a translator, and how did you meet these people? And also on a kind of emotionally conscious level of how did you broach these kinds of topics? And yeah, so those kinds of questions.
Yeah, sure. Where to begin? So with the sort of practicalities of doing the research, I mean, it was very difficult to plan research in Afghanistan.